A couple of weeks ago, we got a teaser for a new block coming to Space Engineers 2 called the Smelter, and there were some interesting details about the Smelter that kind of freaked people out a little bit. In my video covering the news, I said just chill out, just wait, we'll get some news before you know it. And Prophet Zero strikes again, as in this month's newsletter, we received a bunch of information about pretty much the entire survival production chain. So let's go through it. The Fabricator and Survival Production Chain. The new production system introduces a multi-stage process where every production block remains relevant as players advance. In the beginning, players can mine ore and then start building immediately. When you weld with your backpack, it automatically processes the ore into simple components in the background, so you can go straight from mining to construction. We'll talk about this more in depth in a minute. For more efficient production, you can also use the smelter to pre-process raw materials into simple components. These simple components are then combined in the assembler to create complex components for building more advanced blocks. And then you can see this diagram here, which we'll be talking about in a minute. As players progress and explore to find new raw materials, they will unlock the refinery, which processes any raw materials into refined products. These refinery products can be combined with simple components in the assembler to create complex components. The most advanced production happens in the Fabricator, which combines refined products with complex components to create high-tech components needed for the most advanced blocks in the game. And then there's a little video of the Fabricator, which, as you can see, spins, so I love it. Then if you go back, the Gearforge is a specialized block designed for manufacturing character-related personal items. Depending on how advanced the personal items are, the Gearforge uses any type of component from simple to high-tech. Throughout this entire production chain, the conveyors serve as a transport system, moving components from block to block automatically. As we explained in the past, Space Engineers 2 is its own game, not just a reskin of Space Engineers 1. We're building new systems with the creative freedom to explore different approaches, including a fresh take on production. These chains start off simpler than Space Engineers 1, but grows more complex and layers as you progress. It will be the foundation for the Space Engineers 2 survival experience, and of course it will be fully moddable. You'll be able to create your own production blocks and chains, whether you prefer something straightforward or highly intricate. We're working hard to make modding in Space Engineers 2 as easy and accessible as possible. Whilst this is all that's on the newsletter, aside from this little bit down here about food in Space Engineers 1 that we'll talk about at a later date, we actually know a bit more about progression and manufacturing in Space Engineers 2. Let me explain. So, there's a bit more to this than what they spoke about in this newsletter, as in the files for the game we can see quite a lot of the components and their recipes, so I can explain this in a bit more detail than they've said in this dev diary. But obviously bear in mind what I'm about to talk about, in addition to what they've said in the newsletter, isn't necessarily final, as what's in the files for the game is subject to change. So, let's start with backpack building, as that's the first thing you'll be doing. So it appears that the backpack can only build a handful of simple components, and the rest of the simple components require the smelters to be built. So the backpack is literally just replacing like armor blocks, and presumably a source of power, and then presumably the smelter. I'd imagine there's a couple of other blocks you can build, but for the most part, it seems like the backpack is literally just for doing those basic things like placing armor blocks. The smelter is also more efficient than the backpack, as it uses less raw materials than your backpack does to build the same components. So it's always more efficient to use the smelter rather than the backpack. And again, it appears that the backpack is a very basic use, only being usable for certain components. I've been playing the new Dune game recently, Dune Awakening, and in that you pick up stone with your laser gun, and then you can place down foundation and walls. You don't need to have a pre-spawned machine with you, and then put the stone in it to refine it into something to place down blocks. You can just do it, and that's kind of how backpack building works in Space Engineers 2. To build the more advanced stuff, you need the other machines, but to build basic stuff like blocks, you can build it in an inefficient way using the backpack. Then we come to the assembler. The assembler takes components from the smelter and then combines them together to make complex components. This is one of the big changes in Space Engineers 2, as we now need to combine different components together in order to create more advanced ones, creating a brand new layer of complexity to crafting. Around half the complex components are assembled just using components from the smelter, and the other half also require components that are refined in the refinery. The refinery now makes refined products from, as it says in the newsletter, any raw material. Now this doesn't currently reflect what is in the code for the game, as there's currently more ores in the files for the game than there are refined products, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything, as the game is obviously in active development and we're not supposed to have access to any of this yet. But regardless, the refined products produced in the refinery can then be combined in the assembler alongside simple components to create the rest of the complex components. So there's kind of two tiers of simple components and two tiers of complex components. Then finally, we have the Fabricator, which combines the complex components made by the assembler and refined products from the refinery in order to create high-tech components, the highest tier of components in the game, which there's only 4 of in the files for the moment. The advanced compressor, the ion accelerator, the mainframe, and the ultra-resistant plate, which you can probably guess what all of those do. There's also the Gearforge over here, which sits off to the side, separate from everything else. Whilst we've seen images of the Gearforge before, we didn't really know what it did, and evidently it's a forge for gear, as in things like welders and grinders and whatever other hand tools we'll have in Space Engineers 2. Oxygen and hydrogen bottles I assume would be made here. And the Gearforge takes components from the smelter, assembler and fabricator in order to craft all the different types of gear. So presumably there'll still be some sort of tiered system for tools. The newsletter doesn't seem to indicate that there'll be any upgrading of tools. It just says that it's a specialised block designed for manufacturing character related items. So presumably it just makes them, it doesn't upgrade them or anything. So, if you pull back away from the Gearforge to everything, in order to manufacture all of the things in Space Engineers 2, you need these 5 blocks. It's not like Space Engineers 1, where you just need the refinery and the assembler. The assembler does everything and the refinery just refines ores. You need everything in order to do it. And personally, I like this, and I assume a lot of people are a big fan of the added complexity as well. Now, I don't know if I really want to talk about this, because I really don't want to talk to people in the comments about this. But the big irk that people had with the smelter video is that it said in the description of the video that there weren't going to be ingots in Space Engineers 2. Now that's not technically true. If what's in the files for the game is to be believed, there are components that are just ingots. So there's a component called the lead bar, which is, a lead bar. And there's also a magnesium bar as well. In fact, pretty much all the refined products produced by the refinery look like a refined storage form of each material in Space Engineers 2. It's almost as if the refinery refines the ores into a form that is generic and usable by other machines, kind of like, an ingot. And whilst it doesn't have the word ingot in it, and they don't necessarily look directly like ingots, I would still suggest that some steel bars and a silver rod is just a kind of alternative form of an ingot, I feel like I'm preempting to battle the straw man argument, but I don't care. I don't need ingots in my game to be complicated. What I really want out of Space Engineers is something like applied energistics in Minecraft, where you have all your items in a computer and you press a button and then you hear all the machines whir up in the background, you hear a bunch of processing happen, and then bing, your item comes out in front of you. I don't really care what processes it takes to get there. I just like doing the automation part of that. So I really don't care if ingots are in the game or not. But also, these are ingots, just with a different name. They're not even produced in that much of a different way to how ingots are currently produced in Space Engineers 1. I also really like that this kind of assembly workflow is really simple at the beginning, but then branches out to all the different machines later. Because, as I mentioned in my previous video, Space Engineers is very punishing at the beginning of the game. It's really bad. The beginning of the game puts so many people off it. As I mentioned in my last video on the topic, the learning curve and difficulty curve at the beginning of Space Engineers is like a brick wall. And I see so many comments on my tutorial videos of people just smacking into that wall and being overwhelmed. Even in the comments on my last video, people were saying whilst they love the game now, they really struggled to get into it to begin with because of how punishing it is. So making the beginning just limited to the backpack and the smelter, then expanding out into all these different machines, I think is personally a good idea. The complexity ramps up as you progress through the game, with you needing 5 machines by the end of the game to build everything, which is 2.5 times what you currently need in Space Engineers 1. And there's also the added complexity of using components to craft other components, adding another layer on top of that. I hope that hearing the full context of this full manufacturing system hopefully puts people's mind at ease about, potential changes to it. Because I think most of the issue was there was a post with the refinery and then it said, oh, we weren't doing ingots in Space Engineers 2. And I think that freaked a lot of people out. They thought the game was going to be dumbed down a massive amount, and it's clearly not. You only have to look at this screenshot and see that you need all 4 of these machines, not just the 2 machines you need in Space Engineers 1. And that you need components to build other components. Again, that's a massive change. It's a really interesting change. And whilst maybe you could make the argument that it could be a bit more complicated, we don't really know how gathering the ores and stuff works yet. For example, on a previous teaser, we were shown a map and it appears to have text at the top for raw resources. So maybe resources are localized to certain areas of the map. We don't know that yet, so there might be more to this production cycle than just having the 5 machines. There's still a lot of unknowns with this, but again, what we've seen so far seems pretty good to me. Comment section, don't you agree? Anyway, there's a video of the Fabricator, and the Fabricator looks pretty cool. It's quite a big machine, and as I said, it has the spinning thing in the middle, and I love spinning things. I feel like I said that so much that it's kind of a meme, but I do legitimately like when the blocks have little interactive elements like this on them. It just makes them feel more alive than the static blocks that we have quite a lot of in Space Engineers 1. In recent updates to Space Engineers 1, we've got quite a lot of dynamic blocks, and I really love these blocks because they just feel so much better than the base game static ones. So I'm legitimately happy with the art direction in Space Engineers 2, that a lot of these dynamic elements are on blocks. And like all the other manufacturing blocks, there's 4 slots on the front here, 2 for speed and 2 for energy. I remember a while back there was a screenshot for how batteries work in Space Engineers 2, and they're kind of modular where you can slot batteries into a unit in order to increase its capacity. So I presume that these upgrade modules work in a similar way, where you slot something into this gap and then that juices up the machine to either go faster or be more energy efficient. My only thought is maybe they're a little bit small to be upgrade modules, but we'll see. I've seen people saying that they're conveyor ports, and I don't think so, mainly because of how close these ports are to each other. It definitely seems like we'll be plugging some sort of module in there. In the newsletter, we also got the first look at a new block coming to Space Engineers 1 called the Food Processor. Yes, that's right, they're adding food to Space Engineers 1 if you can believe it. But we'll leave talking about that to a more dedicated Space Engineers 1 video. And whilst we're speaking of future videos, it was announced that the modding update for Space Engineers 2 is releasing tomorrow. And I'm sure it'll include a bunch of other stuff aside from modding as well. So we'll be doing a video on that next week. So if you want to see either of those videos, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel to keep up to date with everything to do with Space Engineers. And also, if you want to go the extra mile, you can become a Patreon or YouTube member with the links in the description below.